Thank you all. It's nice to have a good crowd for this topic, and typical of Kettering leaders, there are a lot of them are here because I know this topic is very important to the fabric of Kettering. I'm going to quickly introduce the panel and then kind of what we're going to try to accomplish today, and then this one wants to be very, very interactive, so we're going to count on questions, comments, and thoughts from you. But on my left, a Kettering member, Bob Wright, distinguished military career, concluding as a Rear Admiral. Initially a fighter pilot, director of the Space and Network Warfare Program, which is a big data, highly strategic program, and then director of strategic communications, and then the deputy commander of the U.S. Second Fleet and U.S. Fleet Forces Command. He now chairs the Business Intelligence and Analytics Society for TAG, Technology Association of Georgia. He's the events chairman for Business Executives for National Security, which is an organization a number of you know about, but it's a lot of senior executives that care about national security and get together to kind of share ideas and talk and help shape some thoughts. And if you fly overseas on Delta, he might be your pilot. He likes the Dubai route, and we're going to Dubai in August, and so we're hoping he's in the front of the plane as we go. So
I'm bidding that trip.
That would be a big treat. Dick Teters, who is the founder and director of the Center for Accountable Leadership at Kennesaw. He's also the director of the Center for Industrial Collaboration at Kennesaw. He's an instructor of management and entrepreneurship, so he's a teacher as well as running these centers. Like Bob, has a distinguished military career. Chief of Staff, COO of the U.S. Army. I know. Of the U.S. Army Recruiting Command and Chief of Financial Operations and Systems, U.S. Army Forces Command, and holds the rank of retired colonel. You know me from the Chapter 2 comments. What you may not know is I was Director of Business Practices for IBM at a time when IBM was engaging outside people selling their products. So how do you carry the culture of IBM into outside resellers? An entrepreneur, founded 3 companies. One of those was a company called Partners in Ethics, where I was working with CEOs and boards to make ethical behavior and good business practices part of the management framework. So instead of signing something once a year and promising to be good, you actually made it something that was an everyday practice. And then I teach ethics to EMBA students at Kennesaw and serve on their EMBA advisory board. So together we kind of bring a military and education and a business background to this conversation, which I think will be fascinating for hopefully for all of you. The goal is to kind of stimulate some thinking and answer questions on these topics, and we're going to kind of focus on 3 main topics. The first is, what is ethics and integrity, and why does it matter? The second is emerging challenges and headlines. So what are some of the things that are getting the headlines, and what do we think about those? And you'll have a chance to name some that you think about as well. And the third is takeaways. What can you do as leaders to improve ethics and integrity in our business culture? So I want to start by asking you all, how do you, when you think about something, how do you judge ethics and integrity? What do you look for? What triggers putting something, an action or a person, in one bucket or the other?
I think track record's a huge thing. I mean, you look at whether people do what they say they're going to do. That's a big piece of it.
Okay. Anybody else? Yes, Michelle.
What did they do when no one's looking?
Okay.
How do you know if you can't see them?
Certainly tracks some behavior.
I think it's working with someone in the agency that has a win-win mentality where both parties benefit, and it's not a one-sided transaction.
Does that come from a realtor?
Yes.
Doing the right thing regardless of the consequence.
Okay. I think there was another hand in the back.
I think when the going gets tough, the true character of people come out. The true character comes out, and in my business, being a CPA, there's the right way to do it, and then there's the wrong way. crosses the line of your moral compass and what the right thing is to do, you know, that's how I measure, right? What you do when the going gets tough.
Does everybody have, Larry, you want a
I
question?
would just say is not doing something that is politically correct, but more ethically and morally correct.
Okay. Is there a shortage of that today? Is there a shortage of that today in our society?
We did.
So, Dick, part of his work is kind of interesting in the center he runs, and I asked him to answer this question. He said, "I don't judge. I let people. I give them information. I let them reach a conclusion." So, you want to talk a little bit about what you do?
One of the things that we did, oh, by the way, it's not the Center for Accountable Leadership. It's for accountable leaders. I don't teach leadership. But what we've done since 2008 is we've identified men and women who are very successful in business, and they're known throughout their industry and adjacent relationships for very high integrity. And we sit them in front of the camera, and we just ask them to tell their story, start where they want to start, finish where they want to finish. And contrary to an academic research or a journalist or an oral historian, we don't ask questions to sort of answer the questions that we have in mind. We just let them talk. We take those and we allow students to review them in detail in class. And so what they'll do is a student will select one of the 25 or so, and they'll sort of research that person in depth. Then they'll watch all the videos that were selected by all the other members of the class. And what we're finding is that we all have different perspectives as to when we hear people talk and when they say things. So when I listen to the interviews as they're being told to me, because they basically tell their stories to me while the camera's running, I filter things based upon my mechanism as to what I think is important. And after it's all over with, I'll write a little synopsis as to what I took from it. My students, on the other hand, will do the same thing after they watch the videos. And it's interesting that they hear the same thing, they prioritize things in a different way. And rather than trying to tell them what traits are important for integrity or what traits are important for leadership, they actually deduce for themselves what is important. This last semester, when we finish the class, we have a video session in which I ask them a series of questions because that's their final exam basically. And what was interesting, when I asked the question, "What did you learn from this experience?" The first of the students to speak up says, "Maybe it's more important what I didn't learn," which was kind of threw me off base. And what they didn't learn was that there was a set of rules that you had to abide by in order to be a leader with integrity. There's no one trait. And it was kind of, we all, as teachers, I guess we say, well, here are the 5 things you've got to learn, report those back to me. Well, what the students learned was those rules don't apply. And I think to cap off sort of the learning experience, are you familiar with Bloomberg West? And now they have a thing called Studio 1.0. There's an interview process in Bloomberg West, comes out of California. I think it's Emily Wong sits down with somebody and interviews people. She interviewed a gentleman who had been the chief technology officer for 3 of the major, Facebook and a few other big name companies, and was asked about the integrity thing, and he said, "We're very moral, but there's a lot of gray area on the integrity side." And I listened to that and I said, "What do you mean there's a gray area?" And so there's a value proposition in the millennials that says, "Oh, we're moral because we're thinking out for other people," as opposed to my word is my bond type of a mentality that some of us would have ascribed to. And so what's becoming apparent in the 20-year-old world is that they're moral, they think they're moral, but what are the boundaries of integrity? They're still trying to figure that out because they see the new world as being sort of a flexible integrity kind of a situation. which is contrary to what my students are saying. My students are seeing hardcore, straightforward. These are the things that I, as a student or as an individual, take away from listening to these men and women as being important. And so I'm willing to talk at length about what my students learn, and I'm one of those optimistic guys. I'm one of those guys that I've been around 20-year-olds my entire life, so everything is rosy on the horizon.
I want to ask Bob a question, so we'll circle this around with. So, Bob, how do you judge character, and why does it matter in the military?
I'll get to that question just in a moment. Experiences that I have had, particularly in my last 5 or 6 years, that allow me to critique that. My last couple of tours were all dealing with fleet operations. So, voice of the Navy is with the Chief of Naval Operations. Voice of the Fleets is with Fleet Forces Command, my last command. And so everything operational, from SEALs through submarines through carrier strike groups, is what our business line was certifying those folks for major combat operations and pushing them forward. 10,000 plus a year, folks. Then, after I retired, an organization came and asked me for some assistance, some help, Character Education Partnership, or character.org in Washington, D.C. And I worked with them pretty extensively for about a year and a half. So it was an incredible immersion that I did have in the character, ethics, and integrity space. And it was a deep inward look. I don't mean inward in me. I mean inward within persona, within people. And so that it is some of those takeaways that I'll share with you today. So circling back to that question of character. And Dick, I'll tell you, when you were speaking, all I'm thinking of is I felt so time compressed in having to transfer insight, experiences, tactics, procedures of character and ethics, always so compressed that we almost couldn't allow self-discovery where I operated. So on the issue of character and ethics, and I like the comments the audience made. You know it when you see it. Without pressure, a lot of times, you don't have the opportunity to see where that particular person stands. In an environment or a situation where you don't have those sorts of pressures, you almost have to spend time and get close to someone to understand what it's all about. And my feeling is captain of your soul, that when you see that ballast, that inner strength, and it's not positional dependent, it's not gender dependent, it is just a unique conscience of ballast. And I mean, this audience, I felt like we could almost walk away with a lot of the comments that were said this morning, because you're grasping it. But I think what we're going to do is flesh it out more.
So, from the business perspective, something that has always intrigued me is the question, who judges ethics and integrity in business, and why do people do unethical things? And when we have laws, we have an adjudication process. There are courts. We may or may not like the outcome, but there's a process, and we have to trust the process. And it said, was the intent of the law met or not? And if so, then you're fine, and if not, then whatever has to happen. We had obviously a big ruling yesterday. But in ethics, there is no adjudication process. It is each of you. And you don't all have the same scale. And not all of us were blessed with being brought up with a grandmother or grandfather that gave us a good moral compass. So whatever you do is being judged by a wide array of people, and they're going to draw conclusions about whether they're going to trust you or not, or they would want to partner with you. And Dick talked about the gray area. So if you're in the middle of the gray area, a bunch of those people are going to say, you know what, I'm not sure, this person's kind of on the left of my mark, and the others are going to say this person's on the right of my mark. So it becomes, how do you make sure that you're at the fringe of the gray area you can't operate without ever getting in the gray area. I mean, sometimes you have to make risk decisions, and you can ask 5 different people for an opinion and get 5 different answers. So, but that's always kind of intrigued me. So why do people do unethical things? A lot of the work I've done is, there's a lot of things in the press about CEOs that have sort of led their company down the path, but actually more mischief comes from within the company and at middle management levels. And there's a quick story of a guy who was with MCI back in MCI WorldCom, kind of before it collapsed and went down. And he was in the accounts payable area. And he had gotten promoted to manager of the accounts payable area for one of their 3 sectors. One sector was the big companies, and the good news is they paid their bills. The bad news is they got the biggest discount, so it was low profit margin. The middle was kind of the smaller companies, mid-sized companies. The bottom was the 900 numbers. So that was all the sex lines and the people that you pay when you call in, and so that's what he was managing. It was growing very rapidly, and he concluded that the write-off budget, because people would say, well, I didn't do that, my child must have done that, whatever. So the write-off budget needed to go from $40 million to $120 million 1 year after the next year. Took that to his bosses and said, here's my analysis. And they said, we'll get back to you. They came back to him a few days later, just put a memo on his desk saying, your write-off budget for next year is $25 million. I should have gone back and said, you must not have understood. We need to talk. But he didn't. He said, that's the target they've given me. I want to do good in my job. I'm going to go find a way to do it. So he talked to a friend of his, and he said, there's this Canadian bank. They're trying to get into the U.S. They would be anxious to take that on, take on the accounts payable stuff, receivables. And so he met with the bank, and they said, yeah, we're anxious to get in. This sounds good. We just have 2 questions, or 1 question. Are you authorized to make this arrangement? And he lied and said yes. So they made the arrangement. 6 months go by. The bank figures out that what he knew before, that it's way above what they anticipated. And so they said, we need to talk to your management, because this isn't kind of what we expected. He panics, goes back to his friend, who says, well, that's going to be a problem. Let me introduce you to a banker in the Cayman Islands. And so that banker says, I'll give you a letter of credit to get the Canadian bank off your back. So they do that, and of course that's worthless, and it all blows up. Now the point is, he didn't profit at all from what he did. He did it solely because he wanted to do good at his job, keep his job, and get another promotion. And that happens all the time. And sometimes it's our fault as leaders, because we give people irresponsible targets that we know they can't make without doing something. And sometimes it's their fault because they're just trying to find a way to beat the system. But so any questions from you all before we continue with our next question? Are we on kind of target with this conversation?
So what are the consequences of lying? Okay, so if a person lies, and it's an ethical dilemma, right, for whatever it is, if you are the whistleblower or whatever, I mean, what kind of protections do you have? What kind of safeguards do you have if you call the question?
In the business world, I will tell you, whistleblowers almost always lose. It's a sad statement, but they are either harassed or one way or another they are tainted. I also tell you that a company with good ethics will say, if you make a mistake, if we find that you did something and you admit that you did it, then we'll find a way to work with you. If you lie and we find out you lied, you're gone. But unfortunately, in some companies, the high performers seem to operate to a different standard. So, yes, Michelle.
I think, I look at that guy who lied, that was a pride issue, in my opinion. And he didn't want to say no, but he had the data, and he didn't want to accept that the opinion, potentially, of the provider, the bank, Canadian bank, that he didn't have the power. And so, I mean, I see a pride issue throughout that series of steps.
Mr. Chair, if I may, I think the whole issue is tell me how I'm measured and tell me how I perform. And yes, this man probably had some issues, but this all rolls back to leadership and how you're managing people and how you're setting targets. It was unrealistic, it was unfair, it was uninformed, and they should know how people are going to react. So, sorry with the passion, but this all goes back to leadership and management.
No, I think you're right, because, you know, if the senior leader says, do whatever's required, wink, wink, nod, nod, then the signal has been given, you can lie, cheat, and steal, whatever you need to do, just don't tell me about it. That kind of a mentality that...
Yeah. No, it is like today when we came here, I bet you 99% of the people who came here broke the traffic law by speeding. Because the speed limit is not fair in our mind, so we break it. The same way, when you set yourself a failure by setting some rules that are unattainable, they will break it. Or you are setting it them break it, so to speak.
Well, Newt Gingrich once said that in the United States, the speed limit is a minimum acceptable achievement.
So let me ask you all, hang on just a second. I want to ask you a question. How many of you at one point have been given a target that you felt was unattainable or irresponsible? Yeah.
I'd like to go back to your question, sir, if I may. Was your question a one about legal protection, or was it more personal integrity?
No, it's all the above.
All the above?
I mean, it is legal, too.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm caught in a situation where the CEO lied to me.
Yeah.
He just lied, and he's gone to, he's not reviewing the data, which is very convincing to do one thing.
Right.
And he's already made the call, and he lied. I mean, he just flat out lied. And so the question is,
yeah,
I'm the head of HR, so I'm faced with a dilemma, right? Do I just take it on the chin and do as everybody else does?
No, you
Put your
can't.
head down and just let it go away.
But the comment made earlier when we were talking about what does it mean to you, you know, doing the right thing regardless of the consequences. In our videos and our stories, there are documented cases of people who have become successful in their second and third careers, if you will, having walked away from the organization just because of that. You know, when you start talking about what causes the thing, whether it's the leadership or whatnot, or the person's personal compass, you end up with a situation in which if your compass says that this is not the right place, you need to exit the stage left and find a way out. And oh, by the way, it never hurts you when you leave for integrity purposes. It does hurt you, like Jim was saying, when you're trying to stay and protect yourself within the organization and fighting back. That always seems to work against you. But I guess the classic case is, you're familiar with AGCO up in Gwinnett County. I guess, what is it, the second largest producer of farm machinery in the world, was started at, Bob Radcliffe started at age 57, having walked away from a circumstance at Uniroyal Tire, where he found out that the board was trying to conspire a stock price boost in order to sell it off and cash out. He turned in the stock and walked away from it, and that's how it was. And so you have to be willing to do that. And so I would just leave it at that.
Yeah, so I want to make sure we cover a couple of topics if I can. So
We still have
well, I got that, but we're going to move on. So it's another question for Bob, because it's all good. We could be here for 3 hours, I think, talking about this, which is great. But Bob, the evolution of women in the military and now in combat roles brings a new set of challenges. So how does recent military sexual assault data inform the broader military character, ethics, integrity conversation?
We became huge and talk about all Department of Defense about 5 years ago on sexual assault prevention response. And this stems from what the data was showing us. And if I recall the accurate numbers, it was 94% of sexual assault events went non-reported. So that's however number we're looking at, the ones that you do hear about represented only 6%. My 35 years, I observed these social adaptations and cycles that we went through. When I was a young officer, I used to think that this is more trouble than it's worth because I have a job to do, of whatever we're dealing with at that time. But after having watched these cycles play themselves out and realized that at the end, every single time was tremendous goodness. And now being a senior officer, when this next iteration was released, we were all on board. And it was actually my command that dealt with the implementation. So it was a deep, deep look at causals. And we actually copied a lot of what Army had. They had some fabulous parameters set. We leveraged much of the Army's
It's the first
program.
time I'm hearing you say something good about Army.
No, don't. So the sapper, as this was referred to, was first a realization that we have huge issues in play here. And one of the means of addressing this was we realized what usually is involved. Usually young folks, alcohol, it's an out-of-work environment, and I think the most significant thing that we provided, and we trained every single person in the Navy on this, was a toolkit that you know it when you see it, but folks tend not, you can see it developing, but folks tend not to take action. It might be an alpha male of that party that is going to take advantage of the inebriated, younger enlisted sailor. All right? We know it when we see it, but what do you do? And it is imparting a toolkit to every member in uniformed service in the Navy what you can do here. And we gave them, for instance, if the alpha male, we know, has probably bad intent, you can see it developing, and it is incumbent upon me to, this is a terrible party. This is horrible. I know a great place. Let's go. I mean, one trick, disengage the potential perpetrator from the environment. The battle buddy process, again, a great Army concept of never allowing someone to go off on their own when you think that there is some impairment, be it driving, be it with a wrong person. So it is storytelling, it is tactics, techniques, tools that we would share with our folks. And one thing I will say is that reporting, we place great emphasis on the reporting, that we cannot be a better service, we cannot be better battle buddies to each other unless we're bringing attention to these. And when reporting just skyrockets. And even the reverse reporting that you wouldn't expect, we saw cases of. So again, I watched the diversity implementation, minority implementation, all the way through my career, and the last piece that we did this total deep dive on was the sexual assault prevention response. And I think it's had an incredible impact on how we operate as a Navy.
So one more comment, we're going to go back to questions, and that is social media and the digital age is bringing a whole new dimension to this topic of ethics and integrity. And kind of a question was, is it helping or hurting? And I would argue it's some of both. It is helping because things can be revealed. So the question was asked about the whistleblower. So there are now new ways to get things in play and rally people around it that we didn't have before. So there are ways to kind of flesh out and hold companies accountable a lot, and sometimes individuals accountable. On the other hand, you can broadcast something that completely besmirches the reputation of a person or a company, and it has gone global in 30 minutes. And trying to go back and unwind that, even if it's assuming it's unfair, it's a misunderstanding or a lack of data, is virtually impossible, because some of you see a headline and it says so and so, did whatever, cheated whatever, and you're branded. So and it also brings a whole set of issues. Photographic ethics has become a big issue. Part of it is, when is it okay to modify a picture? And sort of my simple rule is, if you're selling something, if it's a B&B and it's really a Mercedes in the driveway of a B&B, and you want to change the driveway, that's okay as long as the focus is the car. But if the focus is the B&B and you add plants or something, that's not okay, and all that's easy to do. The other piece of that is, when is it okay to take a picture? When is it okay to record somebody? I mean, we now have health clubs that are banning cell phones from the locker room because people are just completely indiscriminate. And where's the moral compass about that? And the sense of kind of what's right and wrong. So, and there really isn't any good ethics definition of all that. So just another thought. So back to the questions. Back in the back.
Well, I'm glad the conversation continued because I can with the earlier, but help the idea of digital, not on the subject of misuse of digital, but back to the I'd love to see the library that you videotape. I'm just curious, Bob said it's so hard to compress all that information into something in a timely way. How successful are you in the videotaping? And is the content, the message they're delivering to the students as impactful as just the image of these people? Bob brought in Vice Admiral Ted Branch this week. Hispanic control is enormous, and just being in the presence of that man, you had a sense of this guy has character and integrity.
Well, I think there are two different conversations in that I have the luxury now with students over longer periods of time to do what I want to do, whereas prior to retiring, that wasn't the case. It really was a matter of leadership intensity at the time, and so I think that is more of it's contrasting environments when you really get down to it. But I can't really tell you how successful we're going to be over a long period of time. I know that we're very successful with the students that we deal with. But I would give you the website. If you want to go to coles.kennesaw.edu/TCAL, you'll see my library there.
And this is Scott's not in the audience, but again, did you change from a content script-based presentation to video?
No, there are no scripts. Everything that I do with them is totally wide open. They select who they want to study initially. Once all the students have picked their one that they want to study, they all share all the experiences with each other. They all watch all the videos, if you will. It's totally unscripted, and at various point in times, we'll ask them for feedback as to what they took away from individual videos, and finally, in the aggregate, you have to sort of summarize. What did you take away from all these experiences? And so the question may be, if one of the questions that I would ask would be, what did you learn from this experience? And I can get an hour's worth of people talking. Matter of fact, one of the best comments we got this semester was that there was one gentleman who said, I can talk for hours about a person I've never met. Can you imagine that? I can talk for hours about a person I've never met. Because he even though he selected one person to report on initially, he was actually drawn to another and just got so wrapped up in what that person represented, how she presented herself and things like that, things that were important, that were almost identical to his being raised by his parents. And so it was a classic case of finding a mentor without having to work with somebody. It was an accidental crossing of a mentor and a protege that neither one have met each other.
Interesting. Executives, I think just a very simple last question is: people coming into your program, are they entrepreneur-directed kids? Are they the finance-directed kids, or is it just
I go across campus. As a matter of fact, when we deal with my program in the business school, I do a little bit of storytelling. I sort of put together a mosaic for our honors scholars program. But when I teach the class myself, we're talking about students from all over the campus, all different disciplines, and that gives us the different perspectives.
Larry, then Michelle. So Larry.
It seems to me that when we approach ethics and morality, we think of them as black and white, and to me it's a lot of different shades of gray. When I talk in America, I recognize recognize that, you know, the company is, in the eyes of the law, a person. So my loyalty and my culture go to the company, but then when I'm in the silo, my company becomes that silo and a loyalty to that and so on down the line. So I think the question becomes a cultural one of the role of ethics and morality as it applies to that culture, and which culture you're talking about, the company, the corporate, my business, my role. So how do you differentiate that? Because it seems to me it goes back to Mr. Spock, the difference between the needs of the one versus the needs of the many. And defining it, it's not black and white anymore. It's like my daddy used to tell me, life's not fair.
Yes.
So I think that's the ethical dilemma that many of us face when presented with a decision that is ethically and morally based.
So let me start this by going back to the gray area comment. And I've seen many situations, and my role as head of business practices was, is this the right thing to do? So I basically had the same power as the lawyers. The lawyers could say it's not legal, and my group, and it was a sizable group, could say it's not the right thing to do. And if we said that, it didn't happen. And I don't know of any other company that's actually put that kind of position in place with that much authority, by the way. But so, despite that...
What do you do for who? That's my issue.
For...
What do you do for the company, for the silo, for the person, for the individual? That to me is the question.
It was all. I mean, is this consistent? Does it reinforce our culture for ethical behavior on the part of our people? Does it reinforce our commitment for fairness to our customers and our suppliers? It really was. You got to figure out that, you know, this is truly the right thing to do on balance and for consistency. A lot of you mentioned consistency when we had the opening question. But despite that, there are certain things that happen, and you say, I can't figure out. You know, it's the gray area. I can't figure out whether this is within the intent or not. And you ask 5 people, and you get 4 answers. So at that point, you have to decide. You have to say, I'm going to go by my own compass and say, this is either the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do. The companies that end up, I think, doing this well are ones that have a consistent tone that says we're never going to drift into where we're operating in that gray area. We're not trying to figure out what I can get away with. The basic question is it the right thing to do? And we'll answer that to the best of our ability. We won't get it perfect every time, but that's kind of our thread. The ones that you worry about, and we all worry about, are the ones that are always looking for a way to say, there's some kind of crazy thing that I can rationalize, and frequently it's competition is doing it, so it's okay. And then that starts to deteriorate.
There are companies that are living this dream. Parker Hannifin, major company. Look them up. Look on their portal. Look at their beliefs, which they lead every corporate meeting, that this is what we stand for. CACI, Jack London, wrote the book on character. FedEx has been doing a deep immersion into this. I believe they're out there. My concern is I think it's a negative glide slope. I have great concern with a lot of indicators of what I see. And so when I see those lighthouses in the distance that we can navigate or reference off of or point others to, I think it's critical that we do that as leaders.
It also, companies, there's a message that you send as the leaders. There's a company here in Atlanta that I think has gone by the wayside, but the company was Morant, and the leader was a woman named Marcy Fuller as the CEO. And Marcy talked in every meeting about the importance of integrity and ethics. Then Enron went down, they were in a similar business, and so they were in a survival mode. They were truly, and so she was just talking about survival for a year. In their opinion survey, the response from the employees went from 75% said the company is highly committed to ethical behavior to 21% saying it was highly committed. They didn't do anything different. She just stopped talking about it. I mean, it's pretty powerful.
She'll have a question.
Yes.
This is a really timely topic, and purpose-driven organizations, a lot of people are talking about being purpose-driven and so forth. And I'm really curious, the tone is set at the top, and I'm really curious about what kind of enforcement you can have when an employee is representing your brand. And just a quick example, I've been involved, as many of you know, in the prevention of human trafficking for a long time. And I'm on a task force right now with Jimmy Carter's around business zero tolerance policies and so forth. And if you're representing a brand, when you're traveling, let's say your brand says absolutely no partaking in prostitution or what have you, you're in Amsterdam on a company trip, it's an accepted practice in Amsterdam, where do you draw the line? How do you think a company can deploy a policy around zero tolerance when an employee is representing your brand in or outside the country?
Dick, you got a thought?
I have a carry conceal permit. You can always shoot the. No, I think you just stated, that those things, that any conduct that brings discredit on the organization is reason for dismissal. And it's very simple. It doesn't
regardless of level.
Well, yeah, but the question then becomes, at some point in time, if somebody reports it, it has to be investigated. There is that sense of fair play, but at the final analysis, if it is in fact bears out to be true, then separation is, the best way to deal with it. Don't try to hold on to people, but make sure that they know that there are conduct.
Because until there's a consequence for demand, then we're never going to solve the issue. In that particular case.
Yeah, and that applies to a broad range of issues. So there has to be a clear consequence.
Well, ask Bob, but the experience, the military experience that I've had over the years is that there have been some really high flyers that all of a sudden one day you don't know where it happened to them. Because they thought that they were so good that they could get away with anything, and they crossed the line, and as small a cross as you could imagine, a bad judgment, they're not only their careers over with, but they are just moved very expeditiously out and discharged. And so, again, it's a classic case of, you have to, it's not zero tolerance, but there is a penalty for bringing discredit or doing something outside of the accepted norm.
You have a name for Travis.
Yeah.
There are a lot of cases that are much lower than that,
right.
But he wasn't in uniform at the time, I don't think.
But in business, it's not only the person, so there's also consequence to the business. Boeing had two major ethical incidents, goes probably back 5 or 6 years. One is they hired an engineer from a competitor who brought with him the plans for an advanced weapon system on which Boeing was also bidding, and they incorporated some of those items in their bid. The second was that they recruited a high-level DoD female employee who was actively involved in the awarding of $1 billion bid at the time they recruited her. And then DoD has some very strict rules about you can't recruit their people for like 2 years after, so there can be no sense of favoritism. That incident cost Boeing its CEO, those two incidents. The CEO made weekly trips to Washington to try to mend the damage and regain the trust. And they had a $1.4 billion contract outright canceled as a result of doing those things. So that sends a pretty powerful message. So it's company activities, and where something happens and you didn't have the right controls in place, and it's also the individuals. There's a question back here someplace.
Well, more of a comment, taking Michelle's comments a little closer to home. We become more liberal in the United States,
and the gentleman to left her.
and the rules are starting to change to create more gray area, especially in Colorado. If I work for a company, I travel to Colorado, I get high, and I go back and I have a drug test done, I've just broken a company policy for zero tolerance for smoking pot. But it's legal in Colorado to smoke pot. No more illegal than drinking alcohol. But if I had 15 shots of tequila in Colorado, went home, had that same drug test, I'd pass. But which is worse? You know, we're creating our own gray areas, and it's going to become harder and harder to delineate between what's morally right, what's appropriate within the guidelines of company policy.
Can I follow up on that? Who do you work for, Colorado or your employer?
Well, you work for your employer.
Conditions of employment, right?
Right, well, I agree, but society is creating these gray areas, okay?
Yes, I think you've had your hand up for a while, and then we'll get back to you.
So I worked for the U.S. Navy during Gallup as a young female. I've worked and lived overseas, and I appreciate all of the comments. But at the end of the day, I don't think that a company is going to define your morals and your integrity. They might have policies, and you can decide if those policies resonate with what matters to you. But just because a company says you can do this or you can't do that, it's right or it's wrong for you, and you have to gauge your employees the same way. When you hire people, it's not always obvious. Although I'll tell you, in China, when you talk to people, you're interviewing people, and you ask them, have you ever bribed an official? Have you ever done it? They will be very honest, because it's not wrong in their culture. It is now. I mean, the new leadership is a little bit different, but 15 years ago, there was nothing wrong with bribery. It was very commonplace. So they would say, yeah, I've done that. I'm not going to hire that person. That's not consistent with the values I'm looking for in my employees. But, you know, if you're hiring people that are not of high integrity to begin with, a company is not going to change them. They're not going to all of a sudden, just for the sake of their job, completely change their stripes. That doesn't happen. So you've got to make sure that going into any job, you know what really matters. And for the gentleman over there who's talking about a lying CEO, you have to decide if your personal integrity, your personal ethics are more important than your job at that particular point in time. And I don't know how you could ever put your character and your reputation behind anything else. Because that's what you go to bed with every night. That's what you look in the mirror at every day. To me, it's a lot more, I mean, I've seen a lot of layers, I've seen a lot of companies try to regulate it, but at the end of the day, it's the person.
What's your time putting bread on the table, take care of your family, those folks come back.
There are a lot
Yeah.
of companies that are highly ethical. There are a lot of companies that have a high level of integrity, and sometimes you have to fight for them, but they're there.
They are. It's a great observation, and so perhaps companies don't do a good enough job of saying these are our standards, and this is what we mean by it. With the goal being, if that's not you, then you shouldn't come here. You know, many of us live in where we have an HOA, a homeowners association. And you may kind of, you like the house, so you kind of glance over what the regulations are. And a few of you probably said, I don't want one that's too restrictive. So I'm not going to buy in that neighborhood solely because of the covenants. Others may have said, like the house, I'm going to buy in there, and I figure I can get away with whatever I want to do within the covenants. And that's kind of what happens. So how do we, as a business, how do we say, we want you to understand what we stand for, and we want you to look you in the eye and say, if that's not you, forget everything else. I don't care about your credentials or whatever. You don't belong here. And I just would submit very few companies do that part of the interview process well. There's a question over here, I think.
Yeah, I was just going to get really technical. Karma will bite you.
Uh,
Karma will bite
Karma?
you.
Yeah.
And it really is, because what ends up happening is you have to do, I mean, you have to integrity risk, you have to do the right thing all the time. And you're always put in situations, you're in an executive situation, or you're managing people, or you're managing businesses, you're always challenged to do better. But it does go to, what you have to lay out is the type of people that you have in the organization, the type of people you hire, and the type of people you surround yourself with. And if you don't like all those, then you have to leave. But as you're challenged, even though you're pushed to take it to a different level, you still have to always do the right thing all the time within that environment, whatever that environment is, and still uphold your moral standards. So, and if you don't, whether you're, if you're in the 900 business, you're going to get bit. Just because of the fact that it's the wrong thing. You're going to have a high level of bad receivables because that's the business that you're in. You're in that collecting business. You're going to have, karma will bite you. It will bite you pretty quick. It might go well for a while, but it's going to bite you because you're not doing the right thing.
Yes.
We've talked a lot this morning about ethics and integrity within your company. What about when you have major clients that are asking you to do things that are unethical or comments from the panel.
It's a slippery slope.
Mhm.
You go down that road, you take one little step in the wrong direction, and the next one's easier. And you pass that same mistake twice, it becomes the new standard. We've heard it many times here. You cannot, as the individual, as a person, as your own, captain of your soul, take those steps. And you have to be willing. Maybe if I was in private sector, I would have been fired many times over. In the military, you get wire brush, you get thrown out of offices, but in the end, they think of it for a few days later and they say, well, I'm stuck with him. But he's going to cover me. And I have no idea how I made it to the rank I did. But there must have been some sort of trust there. So here I am now in private sector, and I would walk from an incredibly beneficial opportunity if it meant that I had to sell my soul. And I think a lot of people in here would do the same. How do we disperse, mobilize those sorts of beliefs?
Yeah, so early in my IBM career, I was in a sales role, and we were actually bidding on a military contract. And there were 10 companies, and then it got down to 3. And you have to have 3 to proceed with the bid. And they were doing things. It was clear that they had decided who they wanted to win it, but they were putting on a sham. So I withdrew our IBM bid after there was down to 3, which caused a lot of noise. I mean, they were not happy. The customer wasn't happy, and I said, but you're not sincere, guys. I mean, how can we take part of this? And my company wasn't particularly happy either, by the way. But you got to have the courage. So you fire the client. The answer Bob gave is you fire the client. It takes courage. You got to go find another one, but you'll sleep better in the end. Narcy.
I think I want to highlight the word you use, slippery slope. Politicians always use that. It's a two-party system. Out of the two, these are the better ones. So if I'm a libertarian, let me join this one because that's the best I have, kind of a thing. If I don't compromise and take the position, worst person will occupy it, which is even worse. Let me at least be the placeholder and compromise a little bit. That is better than letting the opponent have it all, kind of a thing. So they start making compromises. Once it sounds like a compromise, second time it becomes a norm, so to speak.
Folks in Washington, staffers, our elected officials, have shared this with me. 20 years ago, I listened and I thought about it, and I just tried to believe them. But, I was just up there in some lobbying efforts for the state of Georgia back this past February. I'm of the belief now, I will corner them against the wall, and deep eye to eye, and I will say, all you're doing is perpetrating a misrepresentation of why we have you here. So I do not support that sometimes you have to compromise yourself a little so you're around for the big events. I think your character is tainted. I can't accept that as my representative. I told you I'd be hardcore.
And we wanted you to be. Any other questions or comments?
I actually have one. You made a comment that you will never be punished when you walk for integrity. I disagree, especially in this employment market. So how do you recover from that, knowing you did walk for integrity?
Can I introduce you to entrepreneurship? Sometimes you become your own boss. You reestablish yourself based upon your value systems with the integrity that you hold true, and you march forward. It's not easy, but I think that's the way you go with it. Yeah, when you're out of work and you walk away from something, the question's going to be asked. But if you're in the business of having a job, that's going to come up during any kind of interview process. The question then becomes, at what point in time do you become an entrepreneur, because your integrity must be maintained and you've got to live with yourself. I think you made that comment earlier. You're the one who lives with yourself. We can help you at Kennesaw with the entrepreneurship program.
All right, if you bound yourself.
I think, are we getting short on time, Narcy? 5 minutes. So one more question, then I'm going to wrap up with some what can you do as leaders comments from us. But last question.
Different. So when Dick, that story from AGCO,
around? Was that publicized after Uniroyal was found in court to be, like that? I don't know the whole history, it's very interesting. Or was he vindicated in some way?
He walked away clean, resigned his position. He was not a board member at the time. He was the hired CEO, if you will. He had stock that, as part of his incentive package. He turned everything back in without cashing it in and walked away clean.
Was that a personal story that you're aware of, or is
That is recorded in video, and you can listen to it.
at the time, though, did he have a hard time, as she's saying?
Oh yeah,
That he was making the right decision. Of course, he couldn't talk about what Uniroyal was doing necessarily.
No, he had the hard time that he was 57 years old and unemployed with no background. He was a hired gun. He came up through International Harvester and things like that. So he was not a wealthy person. He was a hired employee, senior executive, and the story goes that he was in contention for the CEO of International Harvester, but he was in the truck division, and since he didn't make farm machinery, he couldn't be the CEO. So he went to Uniroyal, but the bottom line was he was unemployed. So he called two of his good buddies, and then finally a third buddy, and the four of them started AGCO from scratch.
Great story. So let's wrap it up. Bob, what can these folks do as leaders that's important in this discussion?
I think to believe that individually you cannot have an effect and that therefore you must succumb is a non-starter. I think, be it your children, your nieces, your nephews, the children in your neighborhood, your business partners, you're not born a priori with these beliefs. It's a pattern recognition of through life. And so you can become stronger. But I just believe that I used to think my sphere of influence was enormous, and the wiser I become, I realize it's smaller and smaller. And I just try to have the positive effect on those within the sphere that I work with. I have two business partners, and we, the bonding that we have between us on this level, that we will never compromise. We're not referring to one another. I've sat in awe that how God allowed me to partner with these two folks, and I've listened to their belief sets. And so I am in the right place, entrepreneur Dick, with folks that have the similar set of inner beliefs. So I hope to see that we can all achieve that. If you're in a corporate world, it can be more challenging, more difficult. But I would be willing myself to leave a lucrative position in a corporate world. I've done a lot of speaking to private equity, financial groups. That is the wildest audience I have ever been around. It's like the closer you get to the money, the more insidious this all becomes. And they want to they always make me stay. They say, please, please stay, because they want a piece of me to disprove what I'm saying. And in the end, they're all scratching their head saying, the guy's right.
They're hoping it'll rub off.
So
So
I think it's the power of one.
And I wanted to try and leave you with a good answer to this question, and found an article kind of that's five things mistakes that CEOs make. The first is assuming that a business practice is acceptable because it's common practice in the industry. The second is confusing legal advice with ethical advice. And a strong person will go to a lawyer and say, can I do this? And the lawyer will say, well, it's legal, but I don't think you should do it. And they'll say, I didn't ask that question. Or, that's not the question I asked you, thank you, and they'll move on. The third is trusting the managers potentially implicated in an ethical issue to investigate the issue. We have a little bit of that going on with the IRS right now. But the fourth is fixing a problem going forward without owning the problem's history. So what caused it? And are you really are you avoiding it, or are you just taking an action that's symbolic without changing the underlying issues? And the fifth is, and we've talked a little bit about that, judging the information you receive by the person from whom you receive it. And the point is not somebody you think is shady so you don't listen to it. The point is there are people who are not socially popular and you may negatively react to, but you need to listen to them because they may be telling you something that's important. So, Dick, you want to add to this as we close?
Well, I guess the only guidance I can give you, maybe just sort of reminiscent of the guidance I gave my kids when they were growing up. Son and daughter, 10 years apart. I guess we raised two independent soul children. But anyway, being gone most of the time and still trying to be the father, I told them two things. One is, you know when you're a good person and you know when you're not. Be a good person. And the other one was, always take the hard road until you can't do it anymore, and then take a notch down and then continue to pursue. I raised two monsters. But what's really interesting of it is Vicki, my wife, kept reminding them what was good and what was bad, when they were straying. And so the general guidance, I can get away with because I wasn't there to discipline the day-to-day stuff. But Vicki reminded them when they were being good, when they were being ugly to other people, etc. And so I think that's the lesson I would leave with you, is that you know what's right, you know what's wrong. Just make sure that when people do step out, you remind them, get back in. If you want to be with us, you got to be within these parameters. That's why the vision statement is important. That's why your value statements are important, because if you violate the values of an organization, it's a condition of your employment. It's plain and simple. It's not trying to regulate, like we said earlier, we're not trying to regulate your behavior but within the organization, if you can conform, we'd love to have you on the team. That's all I have to say.
So thank you all for your engagement. Thank you for your clear dedication to a high level of ethics and integrity. And back to Susan.
Thank you.